class. So this is going along. This whole lecture here is going along with our readings we have for Unit One here, and I want to give you the most important stuff first. So if I lose you in this lecture, you at least have this. So our time period here is 1865 to 1914, and the chief literary components of this time are realism, and part of realism is naturalism and regionalism. So first, let me just explain those characteristics. And as you read the readings for this week and next week and the week after that, I want you to look for these characteristics as you read. And my advice is to take note of them, because when you write your essay or at the midterm when you do the essay test, you're going to want to quote examples from the text that show these characteristics as part of your proof when you write an essay saying, this poem is a good example of realism, or this short story is a good example of regionalism, naturalism, realism, because, and then you quote and kind of back up what your point is. So let me just talk about realism in general. Realism in general is the truthful treatment or depiction of the world and subject matter that's being written about. So basically, the whole idea is to capture very accurately and truthfully reality. That's realism. So here are the main literary characteristics. There are often accurate and detailed descriptions of events, usually using very, very well written imagery and sensory information, sight, smell, taste, all that stuff. The idea is to really capture something as it is. Verisimilitude is also a characteristic. It's just the idea of the writing is trying to strive to capture the truth of what's being described. Also, realism, instead of in the past, in past literary situations, a lot of times, we're writing about the rich and, legendary figures or mythical figures or fictional figures. But in realism, we usually have authentic, real, and ordinary people, setting, situation, dialogue. It's like every day. Um, and it's largely in part because historically, you're after the Civil War and industrialization. There's a lot of newspapers. There's a lot of magazines. There's most of America is connected through the telegraph and the transcontinental railroad, and like an octopus of railroad tentacles stretching across America. So there's a lot more literate people than there ever has been. And a lot of people moving from a rural life after the Civil War into an industrial life in the city. So you have an explosion of millions of people, in factories and stuff, situations that require you to be a little bit more literate. Um, Okay, so the dialogue setting people in situations, like I said, are chosen to be described are real. But one technique of realism is that the writer chooses those out of all the details and situations and people in the world. The writer chooses the ones that lend themselves to symbolism and metaphor. In other words, like if I've got 100 different ways to describe a horse, then I'm going to choose the 5 ways to describe a horse that have metaphorical or symbolic value. So they're not making up symbolism and metaphor, they're choosing the details that are already symbolic and metaphorical. One of the big aspects of realism also is number 5 here, that the whole point is to criticize society. And by criticize, I'm not meaning society, you're stupid. By criticize society, I mean it points out the flaws in society in the hopes that society will correct itself or learn from these things that the writer points out that are wrong. So the whole goal is to improve society, basically. Usually it's told from the point of view of 6 here. An omniscient narrator that sees all that's going on is able to kind of fly around like a fly on the wall, observing situations to describe them. Number 7, usually in realism, it's about class situations. The poor, the middle class, the upper class, and the problems and the frictions between the three, and politics and economy and stuff like that. Number 8, naturalism. Naturalism is a literary movement taking place from about 1865 to 1900 that used detailed realism to suggest that social conditions, heredity, the things you inherit both genetically and economically, and your environment are inescapable forces that shape who you are or who a person is. Naturalism is often a part of realism. Realism is often a part of naturalism. They're kind of intermingled. Okay. Regionalism is also big here. One of the things that you have to understand that's going on is there's an intense migration to America from all over the world. A bunch of different uh, ethnicities and races and languages and cultures are all coming together in America to shape it as who it is. So, like South Georgia and like West Texas and, Chicago and New York City are all very different places. Alaska are very different places with their own dialects, customs, traditions, ethnic mixes, topography, history, characters, like all kinds of different things going on. So regionalism is kind of an aspect of realism. Basically, it tries to capture what's unique about that area. Every area is unique, and regionalism tries to capture on that. So this is what you want to be looking for as you read. I could talk about a little bit of the history here of what's going on, but basically, kind of sum it up. I mean, you have this kind of. I have some pictures here that you can check out. But basically, basically after the Civil War, you have massive industrialization. I mean, and farming starts to fade away. That's extremely important to understand that also America at the same time is becoming a national, I'm sorry, an international influence in the world. We're becoming a superpower. We actually go to war with England and Spain like 3 or 4 more times after the Revolutionary War. We have a Spanish War, at the end of the 1800s here. This is a pretty big deal. War with Mexico, all to expand our land out west. Um, so we're starting to influence things on an international basis here, basically. Also, you have, as this farming way of life disappears, it really kind of destroys the idea of these large, close knit family units are starting to kind of fade. And one of the things you have to realize is there's these huge migrations. Like, you have like New York City going from 500,000 to 3.5 million, in just a handful of years. And similarly, all cities are like that. As the Transcontinental Railroad grows, towns boom around those railroad areas, but then as the roads and highways come later, it completely shifts and entire towns' economies are destroyed and others rise. So basically, you got to understand the whole country is just going through this massive change towards being a little bit more modern. The telegraph is coming, the phone's going to come soon, and one thing that's extremely important and why so many of these early writers like Twain and Crane are involved in newspapers is because they're like one of the most read things in America are these newspapers, and that's where you're going to get your information about what's going on. And so you have an explosion of newspapers, and they also have a very literary focus to them. There's often poems and short stories and things like that in them. So Americans are exposed to literature on a scale that they had not yet been. So it makes Americans smart. They start to read and start to think a lot more than prepared. We've already talked about realism, so I'm just going to kind of skip through this a little bit. Um, all right. I mean, you can always pause and check some of these things out. All right. The last thing I want to talk about is Native American literature. One thing you have to understand is you have the Indian Removal Act, then you have the Bureau of Indian Affairs, And essentially, I mean, don't misunderstand me when I say that what happened to Native Americans and what was done to Native Americans is terrible. But the motivation behind our political leaders are like, hey, we in 1776 we have this revolution against England, but they're an empire. They're going to keep coming at us, and the Spanish Empire is going to come at us. And so basically, the founding fathers, I guess you want to say, they decided, look, if we're going to survive as a nation, then we have to conquer all of our nation. Essentially, we have to put down anybody who would oppose us, in other words, Native Americans. And we've got to expand our borders very quickly, and we've got to get a lot of people to come and settle here, and we've got to boom our economy very quickly. We've got to boom our population very quickly, because if we don't, the English are going to come back, and the English are going to destroy us. And the English did that. They went to war with us like 3 times after the American Revolution. They tried to conquer from the west up around Canada. They tried to. We had another war on the East Coast. We have a war with the Spanish. But basically, the people in power felt that one thing that was important is that we quickly either wipe out or convert Native Americans to civilization, or we were going to be fighting not only the English and Spanish, but also people within our own borders. So they very cruelly and quickly tried to subjugate Native Americans, and a lot of Native Americans that weren't outright slaughtered or sent to reservations, were often taken and put into schools, where you were made to abandon, if you're a Native American, made to abandon your culture, your language, your traditions. Your haircut was even cut, and you had to learn, to be Christian, and to learn English, and to kind of essentially be kind of brainwashed into being a second class citizen. And so you start to see a lot of pushback in Americans in their literature and their poetry and oral traditions that we're going to look at that are in response to that. But that's essentially what we have here in this section. I hope that was helpful.